On the 30th of December, Monty sent a letter to Ike demanding overall control of the theater, and on New Year's Eve, Monty was told that Ike had prepared a telegram to FDR demanding that Schaeff choose between him and Monty. Eisenhower decided that either he or Montgomery would have to go. They could no longer work together. "I've just come from Schaeff," Degingen said, "and seen Ike, and it's in the cards that you might have to go." He explained the frame of mind existing in the American command and the Supreme Command. He told a completely baffled Montgomery of the telegram waiting to be sent from Versailles to Washington. After all, as Degingen said, if the choice was between Montgomery and Eisenhower, it was inconceivable that Eisenhower would be the one to go. The Americans were now contributing by far the more men and materiel to the war effort. Not even Churchill could save Montgomery under these circumstances. The Bitter Woods, page 383. The footnote read, Churchill and Brooke had earlier assured Eisenhower that they would replace any British officer at the request of the Supreme Commander. Dwight Eisenhower, Crusade in Europe, New York Doubleday, 1948, page 317. Hitler refused a request from his generals to retreat back to the Siegfried Line due to the disagreement and confusion at Allied headquarters, and Hitler ordered every commander to reach the Meuse without fail, to cross the river and reach Liège with its massive American supply dump, while the Americans in the Hurtgen forest would be flooded out as soon as the Germans were safely on the other side of the Meuse, so the Germans could blow the Ruhr dams, at which point the British would have a clear reason for coming to terms in a separate peace. But the German tank commander, who almost reached the Meuse, had been using a copy of one of Churchill's old Austrian naval maps, and the road he was going down was not on the outdated map, so when he was almost to a crucial American gasoline dump before reaching the Meuse, he took a wrong turn and ran out of gas. First Army had removed more than 1 million gallons of motor fuel from the enemy's reach. Another 124,000 gallons were ignited to prevent their capture, and a third dump of 2,225,000 gallons was in the process of being removed to the rear. Bradley, page 465. Now faced with a major battle instead of the breakthrough he had planned to the Meuse, von Rundstedt shifted the main force of his drive to Manteufels. At the same time he committed his remaining reserves in the gap that had been opened north of Bastogne and attacked due westward. Bradley, page 469. The Germans had another problem, in that they were pouring their gas out of their 5-gallon jerry cans with a funnel that let dirt into their engines, while the Americans had come up with an internal spout for clean and easy pouring. Ike had ordered the 101st Screaming Eagles to Bastogne before they had time to even tie their shoes, and the Screaming Eagles arrived just before the Germans did, and held back their advance to the Meuse until the Bulge could be stopped at Saint-Vith. And after General Clark was ordered to do a slow retreat, Saint-Vith would be flattened by aerial bombing that made the locals hate the Americans. Bradley moved his headquarters to Namur for the first 2 months following the Bulge. Bradley moved his headquarters to Namur for the 2 months following the Bulge, and when the Germans had first come into France in 1940, they had also come through the Ardennes, right through Saint-Vith. But in the Battle of the Bulge, there would be no Rommel to get them to Dinant over the Meuse River, as he had succeeded in doing with his 7th Panzer Division on day 4 of Hitler's march into France in May of 1940. The new Tiger II tanks burned a gallon of gas to get a half-mile down the road and more in the mud. But the biggest problem for the Germans was that they kept running into roadblocks manned by Americans, even though Hitler had promised them that all American troops had been ordered to retreat back to the Meuse. To try to find ways around the American roadblocks, the Germans had to continually back up, burning precious gasoline in their attempt, and Piper was already 16 hours behind schedule when he reached Malmedy at noon on day 2, where he was able to score 50,000 gallons of American gasoline by murdering U.S. soldiers because there was no time to take prisoners. Piper got stuck at STAVELOT trying to find a way across the Amblev River because the Americans had blown the bridges and were burning the remaining fuel dumps, and it had taken Piper 36 hours to go as far as they had gone in 9 hours in 1940. Piper found a bridge intact at STAVELOT where the locals would build a monument to the 18th of December, but as he reached Troy Ponce, or 3 Points, the ferocity of the American defense made him think there were 10 times as many as the mere handful of soldiers defending that river junction, and Piper turned back to find a more open route to the Meuse and ran out of gas at L'Église, just as General James Gavin was arriving in force on the evening of day 4. The Luftwaffe tried to airdrop supplies to Piper on the 22nd, but the food and ammo fell into American hands, and Piper and his 800 men of 6th Panzer abandoned their tanks and melted back through the woods into Germany. Manteuffel was supposed to have captured St. Vith on the evening of day 2, but the Americans had not gotten out of the way quickly enough when Monty ordered them to retreat to the Meuse, and Manteuffel's 5th Panzer was held up by the stubborn Americans who had heard that the Germans were no longer taking prisoners, but it was mostly the heavy snow that kept them in their prepared positions. Only the German General von Lüttwitz was still being cheered on towards the bridges over the Meuse that Monty was keeping open, and von Lüttwitz was a nobleman from Silesia, accustomed to parleying surrender terms, and he was the one who had written the note requesting capitulation at Bastogne, to which General McAuliffe had replied, "Nuts." Von Lüttwitz bypassed Bastogne, where all the newspaper correspondents had been staying, leaving orders that the town was not to be destroyed because the newspaper people were needed to announce the imminent end of the war just as soon as von Lüttwitz met up with Monty for the formal signing. Even though the 47th Panzer Corps was a full day behind schedule, they got within sight of the Meuse and were overlooking the citadel at Dinant when the German offensive ground to a halt on Christmas Eve on day 9 due to the overwhelming American opposition in front of the British stationed at the Meuse bridges. Churchill would have to admit before Parliament that it had been an American victory, a speech broadcast over the radio by the BBC because the citizenry of Greater Britain were demanding an explanation for why the British press had been lying to them about what was going on in Normandy, and they especially wanted to know why the newspaper people at Bastogne had just been liberated by the Americans if Monty was supposed to be in charge, while the Americans were being described as flailing and weak and in desperate need of British help. Patton always used a Michelin road map, and when the Americans had taken command of their own armies the day after Monty's Goodwood failed, Patton kicked the Germans out of their headquarters in Le Mans, through which ran the only railroad into France from Frankfurt, and Le Mans was where the Second Reich in Germany had begun when the French were crushed by Bismarck in January of 1871. The final defeat in the Franco-Prussian War had ended with the French surrendering at Sedan after being completely surrounded and cut off from their supply lines, and in those last few days the French had lost an army of nearly 150,000 men, and Bismarck marched towards Paris and moved his headquarters to Versailles. After Market Garden petered out, planning for the Bulge began in October of 1944. And the British hoped to get the French to rise up against the Americans by reporting that Ike had moved his headquarters to Versailles, just as Bismarck had done, but it was not to be. The British newspapers started a rumor that Ike was going to declare peace on the 11th of November in 1944, the same day as the armistice from the Great War, and the rumor was that Ike wanted to abandon the French to the Franco-British Union that France had declined on the 10th of May in 1940 when Hitler had marched into France without the bridges over the Meuse being blown, the same bridges he wanted to use in the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. At first it was assumed that the Germans were attacking through Liège to the Channel ports and that the battle would swing in that direction to the north. As the Germans were turned back, however, and continued to thrust steadily westward, it became increasingly clear that there were two separate battles. Thus a line was drawn from Givet on the Meuse River to Saint-Vith. The armies north of that line would be under Montgomery's 21st Army Group, including, of course, the two U.S. armies, the 1st and the 9th. Montgomery lost no time in taking control of the battle. He had already had his phantom teams distributed at the various headquarters, keeping the situation under surveillance. About 2:30 in the morning of December 20, a British major presented himself at First Army headquarters to tell General Hodges that Montgomery was moving his 30 Corps to the west and behind the Meuse if needed. On the evening that I had dinner with the First Army staff, General Bill Keane, the First Army Chief of Staff, talked to me about his initial meeting with Montgomery. Montgomery told the army commander that he wanted to bring together a corps for a counterattacking force and to get it assembled promptly. He told the First Army that he wanted the most aggressive corps commander they had, at the same time stipulating that he wanted Major General J. Lawton Collins, Lightning Joe. Collins had commanded the 7 Corps in the Utah beach assault. He had moved very rapidly, swung his corps towards Cherbourg, and captured that major port ahead of schedule. Montgomery explained to Keane that he wanted Collins to be a quote-unquote savage rabbit. When asked what he meant, Montgomery explained that he wanted a corps to occupy a good defensive position and not to lose it, but every once in a while, when the moment seemed opportune, the corps was to rush and nip the German panzers, then fall back to its prepared defensive positions. Collins reported to the First Army commander on December 21, and by December 24 he believed he would be ready to attack. Already 2 of his divisions, the 3rd Armor and the 84th Infantry, were engaged. The 2nd Armored Division was to be on his right, and it, as the tactics developed, was destined to be the savage rabbit, a role not particularly to its liking. The 2nd Armor had been fighting since Sicily, and it was a veteran-proved division. If it became engaged, it would be certain to want to destroy its opponent rather than withdraw after a short encounter. Already the German 2nd Panzer Division had moved to within a few miles of the Meuse River and seemed to be enjoying considerable freedom of action. The 2 left divisions of the 7 Corps were involved in a heavy defensive action. On December 24, General Harmon, commanding the 2nd Armor, asked permission to commit a combat team of his division against the 2nd Panzer, which had been identified in the neighborhood of the small towns of Ciney and Celles. Harmon had committed another combat command further to the east. Some discussion ensued with Army headquarters and Army in turn with Montgomery. Montgomery had hoped to organize a corps-size counterattacking force that would be well to the rear and kept free of any involvement until the moment its attack was to be made. Unfortunately, the Germans' successful move west had already involved 2 divisions of the corps, the 3rd Armor and the 84th Infantry. Further, a combat command of Harmon's 2nd Armored became involved as the First Army front extended towards the Meuse. Montgomery therefore talked about disengaging the 2nd Armor and withdrawing it well to the rear, to have it in a position to protect Liège if necessary, but Harmon had tasted battle and found it to his liking. His Combat Command A handled the Germans very roughly, and he had a hunch that the German spearhead, now so close to the Meuse, was bogged down and in trouble. He therefore wanted to attack with his remaining Combat Command and his reconnaissance battalion. General Collins had to make the decision. He told Harmon to go. The attack was launched on the morning of December 25. Harman had said that he wanted to take the Panzer out of the German 2nd Panzer Division. The Panzers were overextended and many of their vehicles were without fuel. After the battle, the 2nd Armored Division claimed that it had destroyed or captured 82 tanks, 16 other armored vehicles, 83 guns, and 280 motor vehicles. Harman had indeed taken the Panzer out of the 2nd Panzer Division. That was the high point and the end of the von Rundstedt offensive. On to Berlin, page 273-6. Soon after the Bulge, Ike had a falling out with his British girlfriend, Kate Summersby, and gave orders that she no longer be allowed within range of the Supreme Commander. And Ike concentrated on banning all British intelligence because he'd gotten wind of their upcoming Operation Eclipse, and he had heard about from communist spies embedded with the British, and Eclipse meant to have Monty use the American 82nd and 101st Airborne dropped into airfields in Berlin, after which Patton would have no choice but to march to Berlin to save them. Hearing this, Ike had reneged on his promise to Monty that Patton would not move forward until the 10th of November, and when Kate Summersby was banned from the Americans' headquarters, she was done the favor of hearing it personally from Ike.